Welcome to InFocus with Ejaz Haider. This program comes to you from the Center for Security, Strategy and Policy Research. A word about CESPA. It's an autonomous policy research center housed in the University of Lahore. It tackles issues that impact contemporary security and strategic developments, and this program is part of that effort. Now, since October 7, InFocus has, barring one program that we did on COP28, focused mostly on the tragedy unfolding in Gaza. My guest today is Dr. Barnett Rubin, a scholar and policy expert who is known in Pakistan to everyone who observes Afghanistan and Central Asia, or has been doing that since the mid to late 80s. My own initiation of sorts into the region began with the works of Olivier Roy, Barnett Rubin, and Bill Melly, among others. Dr. Rubin was Associate Professor of Political Science and Director of the Center for the Study of Central Asia at Columbia University from 1990 to 96. Before that, he was a Jennings Randolph Peace Fellow at the United States Institute of Peace and Assistant Professor of Political Science at Yale University. From April 2009 until October 2013, Dr. Rubin was a senior advisor to the Special Representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan in the U.S. Department of State. In November-December 2001, he served as special advisor to the UN Special Representative of the Secretary General for Afghanistan during the negotiations that produced the Bonn Agreement. He subsequently advised the United Nations Assistance Mission in Afghanistan on the drafting of the Constitution of Afghanistan, the Afghanistan Compact, and the Afghanistan National Development Strategy. Currently, he's a distinguished fellow in the China program of the Stimson Center in Washington, D.C. So I might throw in a question or two at the end of the episode on Afghanistan, but I've invited Dr. Rubin today for a discussion on the conflict in Gaza and the occupied Palestinian territories. And that is because I've been noticing that he's been actively observing and analyzing the situation since violence began on October 7th. Dr. Rubin, thank you so much for being on the program. Let me begin with your Boston Review essay, False Messiahs, How Zionism's Dreams of Liberation Became Entangled with Colonialism. And just for the viewers, this essay and its link, you can also see on the screen. And Dr. Rubin, you wrote, it's a long essay, which traces the history and it's multifaceted. But I just picked up something from there, and let me quote from that to begin this discussion. And you wrote, the Holocaust becomes in retrospect the birth pangs of the Messiah, the pains and tribulations that the Jewish people will suffer before the ingathering of the exiles and their return to the land of Israel, as foretold by the prophet Jeremiah. And then you're quoting from Jeremiah, it is a time of trouble unto Jacob, but out of it shall he be saved, unquote. The return and its religious overtones now, and this is what I gathered from the essay, as also I have been in the last 3 months reading up on a lot of writings on Zionism. It's a motif that runs through Zionism, whether secular or religious. And I'm using it in a generic sense because secular Zionism has certain other perspectives also. Eretz Yisrael, a land where the Jewish people will have sovereignty, because sans sovereignty there can be no security. So the corollary of this is simple, since there's no empty plot of land, that the extent of the sovereignty of the Jewish people in any such land would be at the cost of the sovereignty of the people living on that land. That essentially is the definition of a settler colonial project. So my question basically is that, the idea was always entangled with colonialism.
Well, let me put it this way. Yes, of course, that's correct. But when Jews think of Zionism, they think of the origins of Zionism and the motivations of Zionism originally, leaving aside motivations of the state of Israel today, and especially the motivations of Benjamin Netanyahu. They think of it as a response to the terrible persecution that the Jewish people suffered, mainly in Europe, which is where 80% of them were living. And I'm not talking about just the Holocaust, but before the Holocaust, for many centuries, and Zionism was a secular political response to that. That is, instead of accepting that as the will of God and waiting for God to send the Savior, the Messiah, at the end of days, the Jewish people should organize themselves to save themselves politically, self-reliant, secularly. Now, that drew on those Messianic currents in Jewish thinking, which had become particularly strong in that area, because there were a number of false messiahs and a spread of certain types of mysticism. I won't go into all of that. Now, on the other hand, from the point of view of the Palestinians and the other people living in the Middle East, their first encounter with Zionism was these foreigners coming to their country and trying to build a state there for themselves. And at first, they were somewhat defended by the Ottoman Empire because it tried to limit the immigration, but it wasn't totally against the Jews coming, but it didn't want to build a state. And then when the Ottoman Empire was destroyed in World War I, largely by the British, and the British got a mandate, the mandate included, the British issued the Balfour Declaration, which said that His Majesty's government views with favor the establishment of a Jewish homeland in Palestine. So the government started facilitating Jewish immigration. Now that didn't last because the government, the colonial government, so the so-called mandate, had to deal with the resistance from the native Palestinian Arabs as well, and finally they gave up. It's just like they did in India. They left, and what they left behind in India, which now India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, was scenes of mass slaughter, and they did the same in Palestine. They drew these lines. There was no way to enforce it, and they left and said, "Okay, it's up to the UN." And then there was a war, and the Palestinian Arabs, many of them were expelled. So, however, there's very different narratives. People have different narratives depending on their historical experience, their culture, and so on. And for the Palestinians, as I said, the narrative of Zionism begins with foreigners coming and trying to take their land. And then they may integrate that later, as Hamas has done, into certain religious ideas about their, the land being in Darul Islam and so on. But in fact, the first Arabs to write against Zionism were Christians, not Muslims. And their opposition to Zionism was as secular as Zionism was at that time. And from the Jewish point of view, they see it as part of their history. And it's very dramatic that they had the Holocaust occurred to the Jews, which 6 million of them, and about an equal number of non-Jews too, were killed in a very systematic industrial way by Hitler on the basis of a racist ideology. And 3 years later, they established their first state in 2,000 years. So this is a very dramatic story, and it's that the arc of that story is what has given meaning in a way to modern Jews' understanding of their history. But of course, the Palestinian experience and understanding of that arc of history was that they were violently dispossessed by foreigners in league with a colonial power.
Dr. Rubin, we're going to get to that. But, let me, since we're talking about the history of your people, if I take the presumption of sticking my neck out a little and, sort of go back, further back from Theodore Herzl, there's like the two rabbis, for instance. You have Yehuda Alkali, who actually gave, or shall I say, found an argument that made it possible to circumvent religious opposition to an activist attitude toward the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine. This is the quietism that you talk about. So he pointed to a precedent in the traditional Jewish idea of a first temporary Messiah from the house of Joseph, who would lead a militant struggle to open the way for the first arrival of the real Messiah from the house of David. So, in a way, Zionism took the role of a collective Messiah of the house of Joseph. And I'm quoting Michael Brenner here, who's a scholar of Judaism. Then you have Rabbi Zvi Hirsch Kellischer, who also argued that one should not passively wait for the Messianic times. Instead, he called for human intervention to hasten the coming of the Messiah, and essentially referring to the colonization of the land of Israel as one of the central measures. That was his suggestion. Then you have Moses Hess, who wasn't a rabbi, but he was certainly influenced by the Italian Risorgimento and its success. And he was convinced that the Jews could follow the example of that the Italians had just set. So all I'm saying is that before Herzl, and we really don't know how his vision would have panned out, because he died in 1904. And of course, his writings, two of his works, obviously, are not particularly fond of religious Zionism or the rabbis. If I remember correctly, I think the New Old Land, is that the title? Yeah, that's the title of the second book, if I remember correctly, where he talks about Rabbi Gaia, and he doesn't have many good things to say about that fictional character. So what I'm saying is that the religious aspect has been there, and I think today's revisionist, religious Zionism draws a lot of strength from those beginnings.
Well, first I have to say that you are much more informed about this history than 95% of Jews. And,
no, that's very kind of you. It's just that I have been interested in this conflict for a very long time. But I must confess that I never interfaced with Zionist writings directly. Of course, there was mention of all that. But over the last 3 months, after I downloaded Shlomo Sand's book, I started getting all these essays and papers and other books on Zionism. So, for the last 3 months, I've been reading up quite a lot.
Well, I would recommend that you read Gershom Sholom's biography of Shabtai Tzvi.
Okay.
Shabtai Tzvi was a man who declared himself the Messiah in 1648 in the town in Smyrna in the Ottoman Empire, which today is Izmir in Turkey. And he developed a huge following. Finally, it was so disruptive that the Ottoman Sultan summoned him to his darbar and apparently threatened him, and he converted to Islam. In front of the Sultan. And some of his followers didn't believe it. They thought he'd gone to heaven, and they became secret Jews. They converted to Islam too, but they became secret Jews. Anyway, so there's a long history of these things. I would just say that I'm not saying the origins of Zionism are not religious. The origins of Zionism are secular, and they have to do with the collapse of empires, the formation of national movements. It's not just a coincidence that the partition of India and the partition of Palestine and the violence that resulted from both of them happened in the same year. They were part of the same historical process, which had nothing to do with the coming of the Messiah. But of course, people with strong religious beliefs and so on will interpret things in light of those beliefs. The kind of the ideas go back, and actually the actual acting. There were various false messiahs earlier. I mentioned Shabtai Tzvi, who advocated, who claimed that they would bring the Jewish people back to the land of Israel, to Palestine. But none of them had the success that the Zionist movement did, because the Zionist movement became a political organization, and it hitched its star to colonialism, which took over the territory where they wanted to establish their state. And without the destruction of the Ottoman Empire by the British in World War One, there would have been no state of Israel.
No, I absolutely agree with what you're saying, because there's so many angles to it. It's multivariate, and so you cannot really try and put one particular structure on it, as all histories go. But we also see that and it's not just about the Zionist history. I think most statist histories or societal histories have that tendency. But what I was trying to get to was that, and we're going to come to where Israel has got to, but even during the initial years, in the run up to Israel and later, you have people like Z.F. Jabotinsky, for instance, or his disciples like Menachem Begin, or Isaac Shamir and Begin went on to become the prime ministers. So there was this revisionism in terms of what Zionism means. Begin, for instance, at one point when he was the prime minister, and this is something that Haeckel quoted in one of his books, one of the reporters asked him about the borders of Israel, and he turned around and he said, well, they're all given in the Bible. Now, very recently, last year in September, Netanyahu went to the United Nations General Assembly with a map of Israel and brandished it there, and it shows Gaza, the occupied West Bank, East Jerusalem, Galilee, parts of Lebanon as part of Israel. He has Itamar Ben Gvir, an illegal settler. He's got, Smotrich, another illegal settler. He sits atop, or at least before the war. Now, obviously, he's part of the, he's heading the war cabinet, but his cabinet is the most right-wing, government in the history of Israel. So there is something there which obviously is a strand that runs through all this.
Well, Jabotinsky is an interesting case because, of course, the mainstream of Zionism was social democratic Zionism. I mean, with nationalism and racism too, but social democratic Zionism, and the mainstream Zionist leaders and intellectuals always said, "Oh, we don't want to harm the Arabs. If only they would live with us," and so on and so forth, which was not always consistent with their actions. Jabotinsky said, "Don't be ridiculous. We are colonialists. The colonized are always going to resist. That's the reality. So we have to, if we're going to establish a state, we have to use violence." So, of course, that is a repugnant ideology. In fact, when his disciples visited the United States in 1948, a group of prominent Jews, Hannah Arendt, Albert Einstein, and so on, wrote a public letter saying you should not let this guy in because he's a fascist.
Absolutely. But here's the thing, Dr. Rubin, I mean, without prejudice to what you're saying, and I'm happy you mentioned that letter, but the fact is, the point that I'm trying to make here is that the project itself, when a certain set of people decide that they need security for very good reasons, because the various pogroms that had happened and the way the Jewish people were treated, so it would be a very natural desire for that set of people to try and have security. But if security were to be about immigrating to another land, which is also populated by people, and then that security demands sovereignty, then it automatically, I mean, Jabotinsky, for all his, obnoxious whatever, the fact is that he was being truthful in terms of how this would pan out.
He was a realist. He understood the situation better than the other Zionist leaders. And probably that is why his followers are now in power.
Absolutely. But here's the thing. I mean, look at, for instance, Rabbi Abraham Isaac Cook. And in the run-up to the 67 war, his speeches about Eretz Israel, and after the 67 victory, the speech that he gave which was essentially about rabble rousing in a very religious kind of fashion. And you know, the settler project came into existence after that, and how initially the Israeli government was not particularly, Ashkol was like, okay, no, perhaps you can't do this legally. And then he finally said, well, if you want to do this, then go ahead and do it, you know.
Well, yes, it's good. You mentioned 1967. I was talking the other day, or messaging with an Israeli intellectual who was a former advisor to foreign ministers and prime ministers. And he said that 1967 was when these messianic ideas really started to take over the national ideology. They were there from the beginning, okay? But the fact was there was a reality, which was Israel had de facto borders, which were actually our ceasefire lines, and the people who wanted to change that through aggressive war were in a minority. But then a bunch of circumstances led to the war in '67. I don't want to discuss that, but after they ended up especially capturing Jerusalem, then there was this surge of the religious feeling, such as you saw in Rabbi Kook, which merged extreme nationalism and this religious ideology in a way that left really no room for compromise. Because if what you're doing is the will of God, rather than trying to protect yourself from persecution, if you're the will of God, you know, then those who are the people who are opposing you, the enemies of God. So you have the same dynamic, of course, in all religions. You're familiar with that dynamic in Islam as well.
Absolutely.
So as that ideology became more dominant, and the settlement movement was really the fulfillment of that ideology, it became more and more hegemonic within Israel.
Absolutely. Now, another 5 minutes discussing the background, and then we're going to discuss the current situation. But I wanted to bring out this point that Yitzhak Rabin, who paid with his life for making peace with PLO, even he, 29 days before his assassination, when he put Oslo II for ratification before the Knesset. And let me pull this out. So, speaking at Knesset, while acknowledging that, and I quote, he was referring to the Zionists, did not return to an empty land and wanting to give peace a chance, he spoke of an entity which is less than a state and which will independently run the lives of the Palestinians under its authority. So even he, and that being the high point of some kind of rapprochement, was not talking about a Palestinian state. I mean, this whole thing about a two-state solution, even Rabin was not in favor of a two-state solution in terms of Palestinian sovereignty.
Yeah, so that even the most, and actually Israeli prime ministers have said this themselves in the Knesset, in the parliament, the most far-reaching offer that they made to the PLO did not really amount to an independent state. Because an independent state controls its borders, has its own armed forces, has independence of action, and so on. And they didn't want the Palestinian entity, the Palestinian state, to be. They didn't want it to be a state. And the reason for that, partly, of course, there are those for whom it's just unthinkable that there should be any sovereignty except Jewish sovereignty there. That is, in fact, the platform of Benjamin Netanyahu's party. But there's also a security rationale. And here we come back to something that is much broader than Zionism, which is how do you achieve security in the international system? And there can be a quest for what you may call absolute security in which you control the environment in such a way that nobody can possibly harm you. But if you do that, you get into what is called the security dilemma, which is
Correct.
that the people whom you fear are under your control in some way, and they therefore they resist. Um, so you see the lack of trust, which has uh, which was always there and which has grown up because of all the violence, means that even the most forward-leaning Israelis, most of them, are not willing to, and according to the Zionist ideology, they must not entrust the security of the Jewish people to the goodwill of anyone else. That's what you see in the way that Netanyahu now is talking about the United Nations, the International Court of Justice, and so on. They have to do it themselves. Now, the tragic reality is that you can never achieve that. And
Correct.
by doing that, you ultimately create more insecurity. And so I'll just look at the reality. Israel was set up, according to the Zionists, as a safe haven for the Jews. They would always have somewhere to go if they were persecuted. Right now, Israel is the most dangerous place in the world for the Jews. You see, so that is a fundamental failure of Zionism.
And add to that the fact, since we've kind of broadened the idea of security, there is increasingly a commodification of and diffusion, lateral diffusion of technology. And not just the state actors, but also non-state actors, some of whom are very sophisticated. Hezbollah is one. Hamas has shown itself to be very sophisticated. If you look at this is the fifth iteration of the conflict in Gaza. And the tragedy is that a child born in Gaza in 2007 has actually, and if that child is still alive, is going through the fifth conflict in Gaza. So, just to corroborate what you're saying, that with this kind of commodification and lateral diffusion of technology, the idea of the kind of absolute security, even if we ignore the dilemma that is the inevitable outcome of that, is just not possible.
Yes, I mean, and what at least in order to reduce what you might call the cognitive dissonance that is
Yes.
produced by that is you see something, but it's unacceptable, so you decide to believe something else. Well, let me just illustrate this. For instance, recently, when the United States bombed the military installations of the Houthis in Yemen, I was very critical of that, and I said it shows they've learned nothing. That you cannot the bombing people does not bring peace. You can't destroy them, etc. And I got a lot of criticism on Twitter from people saying, but it's the responsibility of the United States to protect the freedom of navigation. So I said, protecting the freedom of navigation is an ends. Bombing is a means.
Correct.
Does the means get you to the end? The answer is no. The fact that you intended it to do so does not make it do so.
No, absolutely. I mean, you're absolutely right. It's amazing. I mean, once we're done with the program, I will send you my tweet, which I plugged after the first round of bombing, and so the argument is, well, we're doing counterforce targeting. It amazes me because to think that Houthis would not know after the ultimatum that there is likely to be some kind of attack and they would not disperse their assets. And you end up doing counter value targeting, which is essentially something that, I mean, there's empirical evidence, for instance, that great paper by Michael Horowitz and Dan Reiter about, the fact that if you cannot do counterforce targeting, counter-value targeting is of no use. I mean, Robert Pape wrote a book on that. And yet somehow, and of course, then there's empirical evidence of what happened in Afghanistan, the nitrates, the bombings, what happened in Iraq, what happened in Syria, what happened in Libya. And yet the only response is to do the same and expect a different result.
Well, I refer to that as faith-based foreign policy. I mean, I experienced this when I was in the government, because if you talked about a peaceful settlement, which ultimately did not succeed in Afghanistan, but the only reason it had an opportunity to fail was because the military strategy had already completely failed. When I was in the government, I found that whenever you talked about a peaceful settlement, people would say, well, I'm skeptical it will work. Well, I had this discussion with Hillary Clinton once. She said, I understand what you're saying about the importance of political settlement. He said, but I'm skeptical that it will work. So I said, well, your skepticism is founded on facts, but you should be at least equally skeptical of the military strategy. And she said, duh. She knew the military strategy would not work. But that's what you see. People believe that if negotiation doesn't work, you must use force. And if force doesn't work, you must use more force.
Correct. Until you realize, after a long time and a lot of suffering on all sides, that ultimately it did not work at all. But as I said in my opening, I'm going to throw in a question or two with reference to Afghanistan also. But I want to ask you now, where do you think the situation is headed? Because essentially it is now mortal combat. And before you answer my question, I want to read out an excerpt from Muhammad Hakel's book, The Illusion of Triumph. And it's a very interesting episode. Yitzhak Shamir at one time wrote a message to the King of Morocco. It was a 4-page letter. And I quote from that letter, as quoted in Haeckel's book: Your Majesty, the image given of me in the Arab press is that I'm very hard. It's not true. And Shamir said he had lived through the agonies of the pogroms and that friends and relatives of his had been caught up in the Holocaust. He understood the suffering of others. And then he goes on to say, I've lived my life dreaming of a nation and a state so I can understand the Palestinians. If you are angry over what we are doing to face the Palestinian uprising, it is not that we do not understand. We understand their dreams very well. But unfortunately here, we have a conflict between two dreams. We agree to the Palestinians having a dream, but they should understand that it is impossible. So I just to sort of position what I'm, the way I'm looking at the situation, that it is, I don't know. I mean, unless there is something happens, I don't think it's headed towards mortal combat.
Well, there's a saying, I think it's from Herzl. He said, if you will it, it is no dream. Because people said, the Zionism is a dream too. Look, it's controlled by the Ottoman Empire. You have no power behind you. You have no army, nothing. So if you will it, it's no dream. So the Palestinians, of course, have the same thought. And I might add, a very big weakness in any conflict is to not realize that your enemy is just as smart as you are.
Yeah.
You see, the Houthis are as smart as Mossad. They don't have the resources, but they will find a way. You can't, short of exterminating them, you cannot. You really are unlikely to be able to prevent them from doing that. So there is the tragedy. I mean, the thing, but where it goes now depends, I think, above all on actions of the United States. because the United States is now very isolated internationally in supporting this military offensive, which is, and which South Africans have taken to the International Court of Justice with the charge of genocide. But nonetheless, they're powerful enough to shield Israel in the UN Security Council, and by giving it the weapons and arms with it is doing this. There's a lot of pressure on President Biden to change course. In fact, today, Tuesday, January 22nd, I have read in the press, let's see if it happens, that there will be a walkout by government employees in Washington from 22 different departments and agencies, calling on the president to change course. And people have described to me an atmosphere inside the government of people very much opposing what the president is doing. So he would have the capacity to change course. However, remember what I said about the Houthis applies to the Israelis as well. That is, if you try to coerce them to do something that they really believe is dangerous, they don't want to do, they will find some way to get around it. So the United States does not control Israel, but of course you could stop giving them the bombs that they're using or selling them. So we're giving them the bombs, 2,000-pound bombs that they're using to destroy Gaza, although it's a little bit late for that at this point. They could stop vetoing things in the UN Security Council. They could, and try the diplomatic path, which the United States says the diplomatic path is necessary, but their actions do not conform to that.
There's a lot of space.
Let me just add one thing. Of course,
yeah,
there is. I mean, you asked what's going to happen, so I'm just going to say something that anyone can read in the media now. Of course, the Middle East is torn by many, many different types of conflicts and so on. But this conflict is pushing all of the people there together on one side, which they are very uncomfortable. Saudi Arabia actually reached out to Iran, which is unthinkable. And there is a danger that Israel could, at some point, Iran, the rulers of Iran, maybe they're even smarter than the rulers of Israel. I once made an accusation to an Iranian in a meeting that Iran was funding the Taliban, and he said, "Oh no, Taliban are our mortal enemies. We'll never do that." And I said, Iranians are not such simple people that they can have only one policy at a time. So the Iranians don't want to get into conflict because they have a lot of other things going on. But there might come a point, for instance, where Hezbollah in Lebanon will feel that they have to do something. I'm surprised it hasn't come to that yet. And then you would have a completely uncontrollable situation all across the region. Now, everybody wants to prevent that, I believe. Maybe there's some elements in Hamas that don't,
but again, it's like sleepwalking into the abyss.
Yes.
That's so. Barbara Tuchman's like the Guns of August, which President JFK read very avidly and decided that he would never do something that could, in a crisis, that could lead to this kind of thing. And yet, when the Cuban Missile Crisis happened, a number of steps were taken that could have easily led to escalation and the rest of it. But I was saying that there's a lot of space between quitting and maximum response. And for instance, during the Suez Crisis, President Eisenhower told Prime Minister Ben-Gurion, "You got to pull back." And Ben-Gurion said, "My cabinet will not accept." And Eisenhower said, "Your cabinet is not my problem. It is your problem." Similarly, in Lebanon, when President Reagan told Begin that you have to stop the bombing, and because he talked about that child with without arms and all that, and he said these are the pictures of the Holocaust, and within 24 hours the bombing stopped. Now, I'm not saying that every situation is the same, But I certainly think that the Biden administration and perhaps President Biden himself seems to have forgotten one basic lesson of realist policy making, which is that yes, you are going to have double standards, but you are going to try and create a balance between the rules and principles that you talk about and the essential things that you have to do. And in going straight up into Netanyahu's corner and not even talking about the Palestinians or the Palestinian lives. Uh, this particular administration, and extrapolating from that, the US itself has lost all credibility in the MENA region and across the rest of the world.
I think they've lost a good deal of credibility inside the Democratic Party in the United States as well.
Absolutely.
But on this question of credibility, that's a very interesting point, because that's often a political issue in which national security elites say, we have to do such and such to establish our credibility. And what they always mean by that is do something warlike. Okay.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
President Biden says that our policy is based on the defense of human rights and a rules-based international system and the defense of common values. Supposedly, our relationship with Israel is based on common values. But what are our values in that case? So if you don't act on those words, which they're not doing, of course, you completely lose credibility. It's not only military force that reinforces your credibility. Your moral credibility also needs reinforcement. And right now, to the extent that it still had it, and some people say it didn't, but it had a certain amount. Now it's lost it. It's squandered it.
Yeah. But you just talked about this story about civil servants walking out and essentially in opposition to or protesting this policy. Do you think this kind of second order effect will have some kind of impact on the change of tack or change of course by the Biden administration, or do you think it's not enough?
Well, the thing is, I think perhaps it's not accurate to talk about the Biden administration, because this policy is not made by the administration. It is made by President Biden.
Oh yeah, that's right. That's right. That's right. No. Yeah, you're absolutely spot on. Yeah.
And he has a certain set of beliefs.
Yeah, which have now been amply reported, going back into his history as a young senator and moving forward. Yeah.
He seems to think that Netanyahu is like Paul Newman in the movie Exodus, or something like that. Is his vision of Israel from the movie Exodus, or something. Because the fact is, Benjamin Netanyahu does not act in the interest of the United States. I mean, and of course, that's not his job description. People once asked me, do you think Pervez Musharraf is playing a double game? And I said, well, if he isn't, he's not doing his job, because his job is to be the leader of Pakistan, not to be the friend of the United States. But so that's true for him. But we don't have to fool ourselves. So, and as you said, we don't know how much we could accomplish, but they haven't tried at all. The fact that they wouldn't fully succeed, there's no excuse for not doing it. So it's just, I know many people, they're just outraged and very frustrated because their words do not match their deeds. And how do you argue or debate with such people?
Yeah. So horizontal escalation has already happened. You got a number of militias in Syria and Iraq attacking US or US-linked interests. You got the Houthis, you got Hezbollah, and of course, do you fear that something could also lead to vertical escalation?
Yeah, certainly. Now let me just go back. First of all, there's already been a type of vertical escalation, because what Hamas did on October 7th was a terrorist attack that is far more serious and severe than anything that has happened in this conflict thus far. Killing that number of people in such a brutal manner. And part of that is why, that is one of the reasons that has given Netanyahu and his government the license to take such extreme measures, which they perhaps always wanted to take. So already, the way Hamas slaughtered people there. I'm not saying it was unprovoked. The war started on October 7th. No, the war started in the late 19th century. But then the Israeli response, the way they are bombing Lebanon, that is also a vertical escalation. Because it is essentially a war of annihilation of at least parts of Gaza. And it appears that they have said that they are trying to repeat what they did in 1948 and expel them from the territory. I mean, it's not official policy. Not everyone has said it, but quite a few of them have said it. And it's the logical outcome of their actions. And when I interact with a lot of defenders of Israel on Twitter and in my own social circles. I've lost friends.
I have been noticing that. I have been noticing that.
I've lost some friends as a result. Yeah. And from their perspective, what happened on October 7th is the most important thing. What Israel's doing is the tragic result of that. Okay, I don't accept that analysis, but that is already a type of escalation that has taken place. And
correct.
In order to, and it could go further. I think that the horizontal escalation, which is to say spreading across geography, is more likely. But if Israel ends up fighting even more powerful actors than Hamas, like Hezbollah, or even Iran, then there will inevitably be vertical escalation. I mean, all these things, I'm not predicting any of these things,
No, absolutely. I mean, it's not about predictions. It's just simply about the possibilities and probabilities. But I want to ask you something with reference to, because as you know, language is very important. In fact, language is power. And yesterday, Taliban were a terrorist organization. Today, they're back in Kabul. You've got Tom West, dealing with them. They are also handling ISK. So in the case of Hamas, is it possible that we start, for me, they are freedom fighters, but I'm just talking about the Western narrative on this. Is it possible that we start by acknowledging the fact that they are a resistance group, they are embedded in Gaza, they are part of Gaza, and according to the United Nations' own resolutions in terms of armed resistance, they cannot be called terrorist groups. And I know that states do this all the time. For instance, the Indians call the Kashmiri freedom fighters terrorists because that is their status narrative. But I was just thinking, and I'm presenting this to you in that spirit, that perhaps a step forward could be to understand, because it will also, in a way, help in understanding the Palestinian aspirations. Because if you dismiss someone as a terrorist organization or people as terrorists, then you are also at the same time denying them their aspirations.
Yeah, well, you can't start with that. And let me just add something else. Hamas, of course, started in the 1980s as a more militant alternative and more Islamic alternative to the PLO. But once it clarified its ideology and put it on paper in its original covenant, it adopted many ideas from European anti-Semitism. And that is part of the, people, and this is so-called Islamic fundamentalism or Islamism. Again, that's not traditional Islam. It's a modern political ideology which has borrowed many ideas from Europe, and so they borrowed anti-Semitism. Now, as they politically matured, they revised their covenant and they took that out. But the fact that they had that reinforces the perception of many Israelis and Jews that they're like the Nazis, that they just, on principle, will never allow them to live at all. So there's nothing they can do. They should be treated like Nazi Germany, wiped out. Now, of course,
yeah. This time they actually used, and very deliberately, the imagery and symbol of ISIS for Hamas, which is as far from reality as anything can possibly be.
Yeah, but the way, I don't know if it's possible, but there is a political path out of this that does not involve Israel directly accepting Hamas. And I think it was tried before, several years ago or decades ago, I don't know. There was a proposal. Hamas offered to join the government of the Palestinian Authority and respect its policies, which included recognizing the state of Israel. Although as Hamas, it would not recognize the state of Israel. Well, there are discussions going on now again of Hamas forming a common front with the Palestinian Authority. You see, so or Hamas joining the PLO, even I have heard. I have no inside knowledge of what these discussions are about, but the PLO is an umbrella organization with many. So if Hamas also joined the PLO, then, and Israel deals with the PLO all the time now, every day, although it used to say it's a terrorist organization, Israel could conceivably deal with it indirectly through the PLO, as it's now dealing with it indirectly through Qatar. So if I were trying to design a diplomatic way out, that would be part of it. I wouldn't start with that. I'd start, but no one's asked me to do that.
No, but here's the thing, okay, Hamas revised that covenant, but if you look at the Likud manifesto, and if you look at the statements by the Likudniks, and if you look at the statements of the right-wing Israeli parties, they're all about expelling the Palestinians from their lands. So if we go by what is being said, then you got the same kind of extremist ideologies, on the Israeli side also. But my point really is,
I'm not defending any of that.
No. I'm not saying that you're defending. I'm just presenting a point of view. As a matter of fact, on a lighter note, since you talked about Hamas linking up with the PLO, on Twitter, a Palestinian, the joke was in Arabic, but he translated it also. And the joke was that this Palestinian young man goes to the Palestinian Authority headquarters, and he says that I want to apply for this job. So they say, okay, so they give him a written exam, he clears it, and then there's an interview. And the interviewer asks him, have you ever done any job or been in any kind of employment that was against the interests of the Palestinians? He said, no, never. This is the first time I'm applying for one. So my point is that most of the Palestinians, including in the occupied West Bank and East Jerusalem, which is Al-Quds, look at the Palestinian Authority as collaborators with the Israelis, and even on the West Bank and Al-Quds side, they're all for Hamas. Anyway, this could also be a temporary phase because Hamas has done something which the Palestinians, they've shown their mettle in taking on Israel's might. But could you give me, and I know it's very difficult, but as a policy expert, you have been doing it all your life.
Not yet.
What could be the three main steps to try and address this situation going forward?
Well, first, I worked for Richard Holbrooke in the State Department.
Yes. I know.
And Richard Holbrooke used to say that diplomacy was like jazz in the
Yes,
sense that you just had to watch what all the other players are doing and react to that. You couldn't predict where it was going to go.
correct.
And for that sense, as even in the military, they say that no battle plan uh, survives the first encounter with the enemy. So
Absolutely.
I think the most important thing would be to start with a ceasefire. You
Mm.
know, a ceasefire and the release of the hostages together.
Yeah.
Um, and that would create space for humanitarian assistance and some diplomacy, not very far reaching diplomacy, but some diplomacy. And I would start with that. And then you have to see, because there are many, many actors that are involved. And for the United States to do what it is accustomed to doing, which is do it by itself. I was once in a meeting about Afghanistan where a person who had been a very senior official of the Bush administration reacted to something I said. He said, "Yes, international cooperation is extremely important. We must convince other countries to follow our policy." So he said it's a very American definition of international cooperation.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. So, the way I look at it, I do not see, uh, well, I hope I'm absolutely wrong, but I don't see any immediate possibility of a ceasefire. Although Hamas has said very clearly, and they've said that, because most of at least over 100 of the hostages that they now have are IDF soldiers. So that is the leverage that they have. And so they're saying all Palestinian prisoners have to be released in order for us to release these soldiers. On the other hand, Netanyahu, and this is interesting, even in the Israeli media, the impression that comes across is that Netanyahu doesn't want this war to end because he feels that the day after, uh, whenever that day after is, it's going to be his political end. Uh, Benny Gantz and Yoav Gallant and
More than that,
Yair
he'll go to
Lapid and
prison.
others. If this war cabinet is they're going to pull out of that. Lapid already wants Gantz to get out of the war cabinet. Gadi Eisenkot, for instance, has also gained some points, having lost his son in Gaza. So I don't know what your impression is about Netanyahu's political future.
Well, I think that, and here I read the Israeli press a bit as you do, that Netanyahu has no political future. His only he can survive for as long, maybe for as long as the war goes on, and that's it. I mean, if he actually succeeded in all his objectives, maybe he could, but it's impossible. So the war, and of course he's also under indictment for corruption, and the case has been paused while he's prime minister. So the moment he's not prime minister, he'll be back on trial, like Donald Trump, and could go to prison. So there's a very, I don't know how large, but large sector of the population in Israel that believes that his departure is actually a necessary condition for any
Yeah,
progress.
that's the impression I also get. But here's the problem. Now he built his career on this simple thing that he is someone who's going to secure Israel on the whole issue of security. October 7 proved the hollowness of that claim. And now, over 100 days, he hasn't really been able to achieve the objectives that he had set out to achieve. So, in terms of the war termination theories, like for instance, like what Professor Gorman says, that if that does not happen, that then the leader gambles for resurrection. So, gambling for resurrection means that instead of pulling back and sort of readjusting your initial analysis, you just double down on what you're doing.
Yes. Well, his declared war aim is to create a condition under which Hamas will never be able to carry out operations against Israel. In other words, that Hamas should not exist. This is what I was talking about absolute security.
Yeah, that's not going to happen.
In other words, the solution, the end state, from his point of view, cannot be based on any kind of agreement or any kind of trust, because there is none. You can say also it would be impossible for an agreement based on trust to work because there's so little trust. On the other hand, it would also be impossible for an agreement based on force to work because force is not that effective ultimately. So I don't see any alternative to some kind of confidence building, if not between Netanyahu and Hamas, but between Israeli and Palestinian political forces. And here you mentioned that Hamas's apparent demand for the release of the hostages is the release of all Palestinian prisoners.
Yes.
Well, there's one Palestinian prisoner of Israel whose name has surfaced a lot recently. That is Marwan Barghouti. And Marwan Barghouti, many people say, of course, I don't know him, but many people say, is the one man with the credibility and the wisdom to bring this about. Because he was actually a militant. I mean, he's in prison because the Israeli charged him with participating in terrorist acts in which people were killed. But he also was a very active participant in Track 2 dialogues with Israel as well. So, to have some kind of a peace process after such a conflict, both sides have to be represented by people with strong military and security credentials in order to win the confidence of their own people in what they're doing. And yet those people also have to be able to understand and talk to the other side. And apparently, they say, according to polls, if he were released from prison and ran for president of the Palestinian Authority, he would win. You see, and Hamas is would accept him, unlike Mahmoud Abbas. Now, of course, Netanyahu will never do that or he says he won't do that, because he has defined his career goal as preventing the establishment of a Palestinian state.
Yes.
So he doesn't want the Palestinians to have an effective leader that he could negotiate with.
So essentially, I think I'll just refer back to what you said earlier in the program about the United States. I think a lot now depends on what the US can do to pressure Israel. For instance, the Israelis have had to get the Iron Dome interceptors from supply of interceptors from the United States. They've had to get supplies of, artillery munitions, 155 millimeter, and various other systems and platforms. So a cap on that, perhaps, and certain other measures, like, for instance, abstaining from any other particular resolution in the United Nations Security Council, stuff like that could perhaps send a signal to Netanyahu that he cannot carry on with the current policy ad infinitum.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, that's what they should do. Of course, I mean, this is not an excuse, but to understand Biden's political dilemma, which is of no interest to Palestinians, of course, but he is facing a re-election campaign, which will probably almost certainly be against Donald Trump.
Yes.
And his own party is extremely divided because already he had, many of in the last few years, especially in response to Trump, the Arab and Muslim constituency in the United States, which is small but is significant, especially in the state of Michigan, where there's a very large Arab community, largely Palestinian and Syrian, he's lost their support, and they're saying they won't vote for him, which could mean that he'll lose the state of Michigan, which is very important for his electoral victory. On the other hand, if he does what they want, then he will lose the support of many Jews, not all, not me, and not people who agree. But the fact is, Jews, the Jewish community in the United States, has always been predominantly liberal and voted. Of course, everyone knows the very conservative organizations like AIPAC and so on, but 75% of Jewish voters voted for Biden, and he would lose a significant number of those voters, which would impact his chances probably in Florida, probably New York and California. He will still win in any case. And it might hurt his fundraising. I don't know. So politically, he has no good option. But I don't think he's thinking about that. He just seems to be operating on the basis of his very fixed, obsolete, and wrong idea.
Yeah, which is that there should never be any daylight between the U.S. and Israel. One of his famous phrases that has now been dug up by people who have been investigating his past with reference to Israel. It's been a lovely conversation, Dr. Rubin. I wish I could, as I said earlier, that I could throw in a couple of questions on Afghanistan. I think I will have to probably inconvenience you again, specifically on Central Asia and Afghanistan. Thank you, Dr. Rubin. This has been a fascinating discussion. In fact, we've overshot the time, but I didn't want to sort of cut in and shorten the episode. It was great having you on the program. The late U.S.-Israeli political scientist Daniel Ejaz, he wrote in 1990 in Jewish Political Studies Review. And this is what he said: the idea of the Jewish people living independently in their own land stands at the heart of Jewish political tradition. No matter how reckoned in the traditional sources, the fulfillment of the mitzvot, that's the commandments in Torah, that's what it means, in their completeness depends on the existence of a Jewish polity in Eretz Israel, Israel as a Jewish state. Now, this essentially means that Jews have a right to establish a state in Palestine. They have a right to establish a Jewish state. This state has a right to exist as commissioned by God. It has a right to defend itself. It has a right to inherit all the biblical land that the Jewish God promised it. And it has a right to enact laws that are racially and religiously discriminatory in order to preserve the Jewish character of the state. This is obviously problematic. And this is what Joseph Bassad, who is an associate professor of modern Arab politics and intellectual history at Columbia University, he argued it's deeply problematic because the rights that Israel claims for itself are central to what the Palestinians and the international community argue is under negotiation, namely colonization, occupation, and racial and religious discrimination. So therefore, without an international consensus on measures to change Israel's ideological calculus on Eretz Yisrael, there is no possibility of this conflict ending. Israel may ultimately think that it has tactically won this iteration, but the next would be bloodier and more expansive. This is all from this episode. If you like the discussion, click on the subscribe button. That helps us bring you quality discussions. Until our next episode, goodbye and stay safe.